welcoming everyone. Hello, and welcome to Dissidents and Dictators, the Human Rights Foundation's conversation series where we expose dictators, debate pressing global human rights issues, and brainstorm how we can collectively put human rights at the top of the world agenda. My name is Kristen Anna, and I'm a research fellow with HRF. HRF is an international, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting and protecting human rights globally, with a focus on countries under authoritarian rule. We unite people in the common cause of promoting liberal democracy. You can visit our website, hrf.org, to learn more about the work we do. Please also make sure to follow us on Twitter for more conversations like the one we'll be having today. This conversation will be recorded and released as a podcast. Today, we will be examining how dictators and authoritarian regimes exploit democracies to launder their ill-gotten gains. We will also discuss the United States' most recent efforts to combat this issue. We have two guests joining us this week. Michel is an investigative journalist and the author of American Kleptocracy, which studies how the United States has become a haven for stolen wealth. We also have with us Paul Massaro, who is a counter-corruption expert and a senior policy advisor for the U.S. Helsinki Commission. The views expressed here by Paul are his own and do not represent an official position of the U.S. government. We will also have some time at the end for questions. If you have a question, please send a DM directly to me on Twitter. So Paul and Casey, thank you for joining me today. It's good to talk to you both again.
Thanks so much for having us, Kristen.
Here.
So to get us started, this last year has really put corruption in the spotlight. In 2021, U.S. President Biden recognized corruption as a threat to national security just a few months before the release of the Pandora Papers. More recently, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and subsequent sanctions on Russian oligarchs has shown how much dirty money from authoritarian regimes is actually hidden in democratic regimes. So to introduce our topic, Paul, I'd like to start with you and then pass it over to Casey. In an episode of the Hudson Institute's podcast, Making a Killing, which I encourage our listeners to also check out, you stated, Paul, that modern dictatorships rely on access to the West. How so in the context of our conversation today?
Yeah, excellent. That might as well be my mantra. Modern dictatorship relies on access to the West, and I really think it describes 21st century politics. And that is to say that, when we were looking at the previous generation of totalitarian regimes with the USSR and Red China, although it's very much Red China again now, the idea was they were closed regimes where the elite, you'd control your elite corruption. Now that hasn't changed, but the elite would effectively be closed off from the West. So they couldn't enjoy what was in the West. And ultimately you see the downfall of these regimes precisely because these elites who, no man rules alone. Even in a dictatorship, you need cronies. But these cronies essentially look at the West and they say, we want what they've got. Now, modern dictatorship has been able to essentially short circuit this formula that once led to the transition from dictatorship to democracy through the emergence of opaque global finance, through deviant globalization, through sort of the ability to, buy multiple passports and all the sorts of stuff we're going to talk about today that allows dictator elites to turn their countries into piggy banks, loot their countries, and enjoy the high life in the West while they deny their own people the very rights and freedoms that they enjoy in the West. And this corruption that they bring into the West, continues to corrode our system there. They capture our elites and are actually able to get advantageous outcomes for their dictators that they serve, thereby perpetuating this system and ultimately leading to the undermining of democracy.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on what Paul's just mentioned. Obviously, I'm going to echo everything that Paul said, and probably will say throughout our conversation today. But there was a term that Paul just used in describing this phenomenon, and especially some of the differentiating factors from where we are now versus where we are 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. The entwining of these kleptocratic regimes into broader, in this case, Western financial systems, using and abusing democratic financial systems, the openness and the, as Paul just said, the opacity, the secrecy that is available to these regimes, to these oligarchic figures, to these broader kleptocratic dictatorial regimes themselves. I mean, I think it's worth noting at the outset, this is not a phenomenon limited to any one regime, any one dictator, any one authoritarian organization or network or nation. This is a typology we see across the political spectrum. This is a typology we see across the world of regime after regime after regime, turning in particular to Western financial networks, and beyond that, using Western financial secrecy provisions to hide their financial tracks, to make it that much more difficult for investigators or tax authorities or journalists to actually track and trace the finances linked to these regimes, to these dictators, their families, their inner circles, being used for any number of reasons, whether it's to hide their wealth, to use their wealth to manipulate policy elsewhere. Think of things like anonymous shell companies. Think of things like anonymous real estate purchases. Think of things like, in the United States of America, anonymous private equity and hedge fund investments. These are all financial tools. These are all asset classes that have been linked time and time and time again to these dictatorial regimes, to these authoritarian figures, to hide their finances, to manipulate policy, and to entrench their regimes that much further.
And I should just add maybe one more thing. And again, there's going to be a lot of me and Casey echoing one another and agreeing most likely. But this builds strategic dependencies. We talk a lot about sort of strategic corruption being the main modus operandi and tool of authoritarian regimes. But this builds these strategic dependencies that then make it impossible, very difficult for the West, for democracies, for the democratic world to respond to dictatorial aggression. I think that we've kind of seen the lack of response for now 20 years, essentially 20 years of appeasement, at least, maybe 30 years, with regard to Russia, certainly 20 years with Putin. But now we have seen a little bit of response, but that response came as a little bit of a surprise because, in fact, I think everyone was expecting a lack of response. What really changed there, the one thing that really surprised everyone there, was that the Ukrainian people were so determined to fight and stand for the values that we, really sometimes only claim to believe, that elicited a response from the West. But I think that it's sort of the exception that proves the rule. What about 2008? What about, the invasion of Georgia? What about 2014, the first invasion of Ukraine? What about the election interference in the United States? What about election interference across Europe? What about funding right-wing parties? What about assassinations? What about, Interpol abuse? I mean, the list goes on.
And even though we're talking right now, understandably, Paul, as you just mentioned, Russia, the Russian case, the case of Putin and the Kremlin, this is by no means limited to that regime, to that country, to that government. This is, again, a phenomenon, a typology, a series of decisions and creations of networks that extend to, frankly, any and all authoritarian or dictatorial government elsewhere. We see the same phenomenon out of China. We see the same phenomenon out of Venezuela. We see the same phenomenon out of Iran, out of North Korea, out of the Gulf monarchies, over and over and over again. The allowance of illicit or suspect or dubious or dirty wealth rising from, linked to these regimes, these oligarchic figures, and welcomed in many cases with open arms, and in so doing perfectly legally because of all the financial anonymity, the loopholes, the policies that exist, especially in places like the United States of America, that allow for the infiltration of this wealth, of this money, in the creation of, as Paul just mentioned, these networks of strategic corruption. Because at the end of the day, frankly, as we have seen over the last 10, 20, 30 years in the Russian case and elsewhere, all too often it just so happens that everyone has a price. Even these nominally democratic institutions, even these nominally pro-democracy nonprofits, think of things like think tanks and cultural centers, museums, advocacy groups, time and again have opened their doors to illicit, suspect wealth linked to these dictatorships, linked to these regimes. And we're only just now finally seeing the tide turn, because it's only just now that we're finally realizing just how high of a price we're going to have to pay before things finally start moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Russia is definitely on everyone's minds today as we have this conversation. So to talk about the U.S., Casey, book American Kleptocracy, you argue that the U.S. has become the go-to destination for kleptocratic money laundering. Of course, most of us, when we think of money laundering, we think of places like the Cayman Islands. However, you note the point, you mentioned previously this idea of secrecy. So what is going on in the U.S.? What loopholes are being exploited to allow the U.S. to become such a haven for illicit wealth?
Yeah, Kristen, thanks so much for that question and for the book plug. And I know my editor would be happy if I said that everyone should go out and purchase a copy of American Kleptocracy, available in bookstores now. I mean, the summation, the thesis of the book, it really boils down to one reality. And the reality is when we think of offshore havens, when we use that term offshore, and I think everyone has a pretty good idea, right? Offshore is financial secrecy, it's financial malfeasance, it's where oligarchs and dictators and the like go to hide and launder their money. When we use that term offshore, what we're actually doing is using a very outdated term, or at least very outdated imagery. For years, for decades in the late 20th century, the middle and the late 20th century, that term was quite literal. I mean, these were places like Bermuda, the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, Malta, smaller islands that existed literally offshore that provided all the financial secrecy that these regimes, these governments, these figures needed. But it just so happened, and I'll be spoiling a good bit of the book right here, but it just so happened that, especially after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s and the 2000s, the United States of America, as well as other Western jurisdictions, realized that suddenly there was this massive amount of wealth linked to suspect sources, or as we called them at the time, transitioning democracies, hopeful democracies that were saturated in all kinds of oligarchic and increasingly dictatorial wealth. So much of that money was looking for a home. It was looking to be hidden. It was looking to be washed clean and have any kind of links to its original source eliminated. And it just so happened that, the United States of America had certain policies available, made certain decisions at both the federal, but especially at the state levels. I won't go into many of the details right now, but there were a series of decisions, a series of loopholes that allowed the U.S. to become the global capital of anonymous shell company formation, anonymous real estate formation, anonymous private investment vehicles, on and on and on. All these different policy spaces and loopholes added up to one very clear reality, certainly by the beginning of the 21st century, that it wasn't these small islands that we associate with offshore that were the biggest financial secrecy havens in the world. It was now the United States of America, and especially states that we would never really think of in terms of global finance. States like Delaware, states like South Dakota, states like Wyoming, that time and time again, the oligarchs, the dictators, the kleptocrats of the world were turning to for all their financial secrecy needs.
I think I just want to add to that, to the kind of policy thing. I think it's worth recognizing, because we need to fight this too, that there was this post Cold War philosophy that basically, when if we economically and financially integrate, and if money is going from country to country and so on and so forth, then democratization will follow. And this kind of idea that the very summarized well with the German change through trade, the Wandel durch Handel, but really it was everybody's philosophy for quite a long time, at least for the first 2 decades, after the Cold War, and then only then really started to break down in the recent years. Really has broken down because of the work of people like Casey and other journalists who have kind of demonstrated how this philosophy is built on sand and in fact is totally backwards. Values need to go before profit, not the other way around. But this philosophy made it very difficult to do anything about these kind of policy choices that were being made, because they all seemed in line with this notion of economic and financial integration will lead to a more peaceful world, will lead to democracy. And we've learned that it's exactly the opposite, that economic and financial integration with dictatorships has allowed corruption to come west and has actually prevented us from being able to respond to provocations, aggression, all sort of stuff from dictatorships, and all sorts of global problems for that matter, like climate change, global organized crime, whatever. And only just now has that philosophy begun to change.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to jump in, one quick coda to that. I know I'm speaking as an American, as someone who focuses much of his work on the United States of America, and obviously Paul here today as a fellow American as well. I just outlined some of the American transition, but this is by no means an American story, especially over the last 20, 30 years. This is a far broader, as to use the political science term, race to the bottom among especially Western jurisdictions to attract so much of that suspect and illicit, questionable, and kleptocratic capital. Right. So I just outlined all these American industries that have profited, but this extends to things like the German banking sector, or the Canadian real estate sector, or the French luxury goods sector. I mean, you can look at country after country, whether it's in in Europe, in North America. So, these nominally clean, nominally non-corrupt countries in terms of global corruption rankings just so happen to be over and again the home for all of this illicit, suspect, dirty wealth through, again, policy decisions that were taken to attract this money in the first place, regardless of the actual cost to the West, to democracy, and to any kind of policies therein.
Right, and I think we want to mention the UK as well. That's obviously been in the news, or coming out of the Pandora Papers, just how much of like London real estate has been bought up by these ruling families, like in Azerbaijan and other regimes.
Yeah. And that note, I would say, just Kristen, there's a fantastic new book that just came out a month or two ago called Butler to the World by a wonderful UK journalist, Oliver Bullough, which outlines the UK story and saga in and of itself. I would highly recommend.
Absolutely, it's on my list. So to go back to the focus on the US, I want to talk about something that we're going to also talk about later is these enablers in the US that allow individuals, kleptocratic regimes, dictators to bring this wealth into the US. So whoever, Paul or Casey, wants to start first, can we talk kind of about these middlemen and how they create that loophole?
Casey, you want to go ahead? Because that's basically the topic of your book, no?
Well, that's certainly one of the elements of the book itself. I mean, again, this money doesn't move on its own. It doesn't. There isn't some kind of built-in property in which the money, you make it and then you just turn away and somehow the money ends up clean. You rely on, you need the services of those in the West, those in these democratic countries that, again, because of policies, because of loopholes, are perfectly and freely able to take as much money as they want without having to ask any questions whatsoever about the provenance of that wealth. Now, think about that, right? That means that if you are if you're a banker, you're a financial manager, you're a real estate broker, you are a hedge fund manager, and we're talking about industries that are worth trillions of dollars. If you have a lawyer, if you have another financial advisor, another shell company operator come to you and say, we have X amount of money that we would love to invest. We would love to let you have access to this wealth on your end. We know full well you'll get a slice of profit along the way. And we know that you don't have to ask any questions about where this money comes from in the first place. Well, I suppose in a certain sense, who would say no? Or to use perhaps a different framing, if there isn't any kind of regulatory oversight, if there isn't any kind of regulatory requirement to ask where this money comes from, to track and trace the actual provenance of this kleptocratic wealth. Again, we're talking about dictators, we're talking about oligarchs, those that are connected directly to the most heinous regimes on the planet. If there aren't any requirements to ask questions about where this money comes from, then why should we expect those bankers, those financial advisors, those shell company operators that already have all kinds of hurdles of anonymity they have to sift through in the first place, even if they wanted to get to the actual source, why would we expect them to do that in the first place? And so what we have seen is time and time again, law firms, public relations firms, again, financial managers, shell company managers, private equity investors have turned to these loopholes, all of the anonymity available, and then beyond that, the lack of any kind of requirement whatsoever, act as effective foot soldiers, act as effective henchmen for these oligarchs, for these dictators, for these authoritarian figures to move and hide their money. And in so doing, they don't necessarily know whose money they are moving, they are hiding, they are laundering in the process. Again, so much of this is saturated in anonymity. The anonymity is baked in. The anonymity is the appeal. And then beyond that, the lack of any kind of regulatory requirement is why we see this class of, as we call them, enablers crop up in the West, in especially places like the United States of America, that have become these go-to servicemen and servicewomen for all the kleptocrats of the world.
So that's an excellent summary of who these people are. I guess let me just say a word on the enablers. I mean, without the enablers, that is, without these unscrupulous, mercenary lawyers and real estate agents and accountants, and I call them unscrupulous and mercenary, but these are really the top guys. I mean, when you think about who these people are, these are top four accounting, these are white shoe law firms. These are not your small town. These are not your your small city law firms and real estate and so on and so forth. These individuals, they build large firms based on accepting blood money. And without them, modern dictatorship would not function. So, I mean, it's really important to digest that without them, there would be a handful of stubbornly isolated states. But for the most part, the quote unquote end of history would have arrived. You would have the kind of hybrid, integrated, intertwined economy-based, authoritarian capitalist model simply would not function. It just would not work. You need these top enablers to work for you. Now, one thing I'll say about the enablers versus the kleptocrats is, the kleptocrats, the oligarchs, the CCP operatives, whoever they may be, need to be brought to justice. They need to have their assets confiscated. They need to be sanctioned. They need to be tried and ideally jailed for their crimes. They grew up in environments, in often tough environments. They're often gangsters. They all had environments of rules that were uncertain and so on and so forth. And they kind of developed a mentality that they really express today, a cynical, nihilistic, I am the boss, everybody's like this kind of mentality. Now, the enablers have no such excuse. They are individuals, for the most part, who grew up with every single privilege, went to Ivy League schools or Oxford or Cambridge or wherever, or Sciences Po, some of the smartest people in the world, and they chose, after all of that, they chose to undermine democracy. So to me, the enablers really verge on some of the most despicable people on the planet. They sell out our country. They sell out our systems, our democratic systems. They sell out the democratic world. They sell out human rights, and they sell out the rule of law that if you're a lawyer, you're actually take an oath to defend. You take an oath to defend the rule of law, and then you sell it out. So, I mean, it's really an extraordinary thing. I often think of during the Cold War, if you accepted Soviet money and you were an American, we'd rightfully view you as a traitor. And I really do think we need to get to a mental space, not just a policy space, but a mental space where it's simply unacceptable to accept dictator funds. Any dictator money at all. Simply unacceptable. And if you do it, your peers will shun you. We will shame you. You will be viewed as a pariah. And that's where we need to get with the enablers.
Yeah, and I just one quick note on that. I mean, I know Paul has again laid out as it pertains to why these enablers are not only profiting from these systems, but through their own choices. But the additional element of this is not just that they're making significant amounts of money on this, not just that these are, again, the white shoe law firms, the leading accountancy firms, the leading real estate firms that are happily turning the other way and happily not bothering to ask any questions about the source of funds or what it may be being used for. But beyond that, they are the ones in Washington, in Ottawa, in Canberra, in Brussels, in London that are lobbying for the continuation of these policies in the first place. These are the primary lobbying groups that are slow walking, that are stonewalling, that are trying to halt any kind of reforms possible. These are groups like in the U.S., the American Bar Association, which is the primary legal organization, which is one of the primary advocates against transparency in shell companies. You can see that in the real estate sector. You see that in the private investment sector. They don't want to look this kleptocratic gift horse in the mouth. They don't want to turn off this spigot of dirty, illicit, or suspect wealth coming in, again, regardless of the consequence and regardless of the damage to democracy on this planet.
Our adversaries are using the rule of law to undermine the rule of law, and it's extremely scary. It's a completely new way of operating, and it's really what kind of makes this political situation unique.
Thank you both. I like that quote, Paul. Just as a reminder for our listeners, if you do have a question, please send me a DM directly and we'll hopefully get to it at the end. So before we turn over to the lobbying groups, I definitely want to address that in a bit. You mentioned, Paul, selling out the rule of law. So we've kind of already touched on the consequences of this illicit wealth coming into the US, how it entwines us with authoritarian regimes. What other consequences do we see of this illicit wealth coming into the U.S., both for the people living under authoritarian regimes and for the U.S.?
I mean, the consequences are simply massive. I mean, for those living under authoritarian regimes, it's obviously the perpetuation of the authoritarian regime and the consolidation of power. I mean, the notion that this is a formula. I said before, there's a formula for perpetual dictatorship, because so long as your elites never get fed up, you can just keep going and going and going and going. Again, that's what led to the fall of authoritarian regimes in the past, is elites that are unhappy. But these elites, they don't even live in the system they're undermining. Now, for us, which of course, for those that live under it, it leads to all the horrors of authoritarian regimes. Arbitrary jailings, killings, being pushed out windows, being murdered for investigations, massive corruption, theft, and of course, death from corruption. I mean, corruption itself kills more than anything else in the entire world, because people starve, they can't pay their rent, they can't live, and so on and so forth. I mean, in a lot of these countries, people are living on something like $1 a week or something like that. So I mean, it's really horrible. So corruption kills. And then of course, for us, for those in democratic societies, it undermines the system totally. I mean, it creates essentially a sort of lobbying class that relies on money from abroad, from these authoritarian regimes, as Casey said, seeking to perpetuate the dole, the system that's providing them blood money, thereby undermining the will of the people, and undermining the ability to create and sustain a democratic system. I mean, the horror of corruption is that these elites, they come here, they come to the West, they come to these democratic states because of the rule of law, because they want to protect their money from the next bigger fish, because they want to enjoy it. And then when they're here, they undermine the rule of law, and our states slowly become more like the states that they're from. So at the end of the day, corruption, dictatorship, end state kleptocracy, end state global kleptocracy is the death of the rule of law all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't say it better than what Paul just laid out. I know much of the conversation we're having today focuses on oligarchic figures, dictatorial figures, authoritarian figures, but I do just want to kind of signpost the fact that these financial secrecy networks are by no means limited to these figures in these regimes. They're also taken advantage of by other transnational criminal organizations, the wildlife traffickers, the human traffickers, the narco traffickers, all these elements of, truly the most heinous among us, the most damaging forces, especially in the transnational space, are perfectly happily and perfectly freely using and utilizing these same services of anonymity, and in many ways, in many cases, following the exact same pathways, financial pathways, that these oligarchic figures, these dictatorial figures, are doing. I mean, this is again, we're talking about, the total estimates for what we still describe as the offshore world are something in the order of 13, 14, 15 trillion dollars. And again, that's just an estimate. We simply have no firm idea because of all the anonymity available to it. But a good kind of barometer for the magnitude of finance that we're talking about is that would put it on par with about the Chinese GDP. So we're really talking, in many ways, in many cases, again, to use a phrase that I mentioned earlier, this offshore world, about really a kind of invisible superpower that we're only just beginning to grapple with, only just beginning to understand the actual fallout from it. Again, you can see that as clear as day in Russian aggression in Ukraine, but my goodness, it is by no means limited to that country, limited to that regime. Certainly speaking as an American, speaking of the United States of America, as Paul well knows, I can speak firsthand, the damaging effects this has had on the broader political space, on the nonprofit space, on the broader democratic trajectory of the U.S. itself.
Absolutely. And that's a great segue into our solutions section of this discussion. So, Casey, you just mentioned kind of the influence of foreign policy on our nonprofits, on things like that. We are seeing efforts to clean up foreign influence in American politics. Introduced last month in the House was the Fighting Foreign Influence Act, So, Casey, can you tell us about this act and why it's significant?
Yeah, sure. No, Kristen, I'm happy to. And I'll run through a few highlights of it. Then I'll turn it obviously to Paul, because he's the congressional go-to. In many ways, he is one of the primary movers and shakers for pushing any kind of anti-kleptocracy or counter-kleptocracy policy, especially in the U.S. Many of the successes we've seen over the last year, over the last 18 months, have been attributed to much of Paul and his colleagues' work. But this was frankly, a pretty remarkable bill that was introduced in the American House of Representatives last month. It was a bipartisan bill with co-sponsors from across the political spectrum, which, for those who follow American politics, may be a little bit of an outlier these days. But it does three primary things. And again, this is called the Fighting Foreign Influence Act. The first prong of the bill, I should say, any of these three primary things that the bill does would be worth passing on its own. The fact that it brings all three together is truly remarkable, which is why we haven't seen a bill quite like this in the past. The first thing that the bill would do would be simply preventing, as we call them, foreign agents or lobbyists for foreign governments, foreign regimes, foreign political parties. It would prevent those from donating to American political campaigns, which it's pretty remarkable. I was just reading through the text of the bill and thinking for a second that it's still perfectly legal for the law firms, for the PR advisors, for the consultants that are freely acting as lobbyists for foreign dictators, for foreign regimes. It's still perfectly legal for these Americans that are taking all of this money from these foreign governments, foreign regimes, foreign dictatorships to then donate, and many times on the same exact day that they're lobbying, to donate to these congressional officials that they're lobbying to. So that's certainly one loophole that we have seen abused time and time and time again. That's one prong of the bill. The second prong is that it would finally ban former American politicians, presidents, vice presidents, members of the House, members of the Senate, military officers, high-ranking members of the cabinet. These are this whole cohort of high-ranking American officials. It would finally prevent them from, once they leave office, becoming foreign agents, foreign lobbyists, enablers for these governments themselves. I think there's the perfect case study of this, unfortunately, is the former Republican stalwart in the Senate, Bob Dole, who was the 1996 candidate for president on the Republican ticket. And, he's seen in many ways, rightfully so, as this kind of pro-democracy, certainly patriotic American figure, but who just so happened, which a lot of people aren't aware of, as soon as he left office, he became a foreign agent, a foreign lobbyist for dictatorship. He became someone who sold out to lobby on behalf of not American interests, but the interests of foreign governments, kleptocratic figures elsewhere. So this is one thing that would finally end that. And then the third part of the bill, as I pull it up in front of me, is something that, again, getting back to loopholes, would force finally think tanks and other nonprofits in the United States of America to disclose significant donations from foreign governments and from foreign political parties. And again, this is a conversation, a far broader conversation for another time. But in the U.S., there are foreign lobbying regulations. There are foreign lobbying disclosure requirements for the law firms, for the PR consultants. But there is nothing for think tanks. There is nothing for the nonprofits, for the foundations that have been taking millions of dollars from dictatorships, from oligarchs, from kleptocratic figures elsewhere, and then pushing pro-regime, pro-dictatorship policies in Washington. There has been no requirements for disclosing that funding whatsoever until at least now, if this bill gets passed. Again, this will be a significant step forward in the United States of America to cleaning up so many of these loopholes that have existed for years and years and years.
So thanks so much, Casey. It's a wonderful description of the bill. And thanks for all you've been on these topics, and then on the bill itself. I guess it's because of this reporting that we know what's going on, and I hate to say it. Bob Dole's an excellent example. The examples are legion. There are just so many former members of Congress, former members of the NSC. And then those are senior people. So, you go a little lower down, it's just all over the place. It's just like, it's funny. It's kind of like a pyramid. We pay attention to the very, very, very top dogs. But then the further down you go, the wider it gets. And the more people take advantage of the authoritarian revolving door. That's what I call this, the authoritarian revolving door. Now, people know what the revolving door is. That's when you're in government, you go work for a corporation that you were regulating, and then you come back to government, and then you go back to the corporation regulating. Well, the same thing, I'm very sad to say, happens in foreign policy, except in foreign policy, it's even worse, and it's a national security threat. You work for the USA and you protect our country against dictators, and then you go work for the dictators and you try to help them undermine our country, and then you go back and you work for the government and help protect them against dictators. Go back and work for dictators, help them undermine the United States and democracy, and so on and so forth. And this, it has become such a normal way of operating that, until recently, people barely batted an eye at it. It was just, oh yeah, of course, we pay you an extremely low salary when you're in government, because afterward you'll get a great consulting job. Consultant, that's always what they love to call themselves, but it's consulting job or lobbyist job or lawyer job or whatever, in one of these firms, for the guys that just beforehand you were sanctioning. I mean, it's sanctioning or helping to build cases on, or helping to write laws on, and so on and so forth. It's just a really extraordinary thing, and it is a huge, huge threat. Of course, in the U.S. context, it's very bad, but in Europe, it's even worse.
Yeah.
In Europe, you have former heads of state and government that work for dictators. Gerhard Schroeder is, of course, the kind of face of all this, a former German chancellor who works for a dictator, one of the worst dictators, of course, Vladimir Putin. He works for Russia. Francois Fillon, former French PM. Karen Kneissel, former Austrian foreign minister. I mean, Tony Blair got his fingers into this with what was it, Casey? Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, I believe.
That's correct. Yep.
But it just goes on. It's unbelievable. How did we allow this structure to happen? When you start talking about it, it's like, what? Are you serious?
I think Paul makes not only an excellent point, but he highlights a very real fact. I know I just cited Bob Dole a moment ago, former Republican presidential candidate, but this is by no means some kind of partisan affair. It's not as if certain political parties or certain individuals or certain political forces are somehow more susceptible to this than others. Certainly in the American context, that has been the case, where we have seen leading Republicans and leading Democrats both more than willing to take significant sums from some of the most heinous regimes, again, on the planet. Think of the Clinton Foundation, which up until just a few years ago was more than happy to accept millions and millions of dollars from Russian oligarchs, from the regime in Saudi Arabia, from, again, some of the most heinous, the most despicable forces on the planet, and beyond that, not have any kind of disclosure requirements about what they were then doing with that money, or how it may have influenced any kind of potential, foreign policy decisions or conversations in Washington itself. This crosses the political spectrum, which is, again, to what we were talking about earlier, why it's so heartening to see, at least in the U.S. context, an actual bipartisan approach to these solutions that we have been waiting years and years and years to finally implement.
And I'll just say one more thing, just because this problem's like a real big problem, and it also just bothers me. It just really bothers me. They buy these guys cheap. It's just, I think they laugh in Beijing and they laugh in Moscow. We just don't sell ourselves for that much when it really comes down to it. For a few $100,000, you can buy yourself the network of practically any former government official in the USA. I think Gerhard Schroeder sold himself for, $500,000, €500,000, whatever, a year. And yeah, for a government official in the West, that's a lot of money. But for Abramovich, for any Russian oligarch that's sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars, or I guess tens of billions of dollars, but Putin hundreds of billions of dollars, but it just blows me away. It just blows me away.
I was going to say, Paul, I think there's a great quote that I was reading just the other day from one of the U.S.'s leading Russia policy makers, and she was it was an interview with her, and I have the quote right in front of me. She said, quote, "I think the Russians were surprised at how cheap and easy we were to buy." Yes. And you can extend that to any regime you'd like, whether it's Beijing, whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's Iran, North Korea, on and on and on. We in the same phenomenon, the same typologies, and beyond that, the same damage to democracy on this planet because of just how cheap so many, in this case, Western policymakers were to buy, to hire, and to then become effective, again, foot soldiers for these mafia states that threaten democracy as it is.
And what does it look like? Okay, when we talk about the domestic political implications, what does it look like to your average voter in the USA, in the Midwest, or in a city or wherever, when for a bag of cash, all the democracy and human rights and rule of law rhetoric, it all just falls away. It all just becomes pure cynicism. No wonder we're facing democratic problems.
That is a terrifying thought. Thank you both. I do want to spend the last couple minutes talking about the Enablers Act, but we did get a question from the audience. What is the likelihood that you anticipate this bill will be passed? But given that it is a bipartisan bill, is there hope for it?
I could certainly say, looking from the outside in, given the bipartisan nature of this, and beyond that, given the actual success, and again, in the American context, especially success over the last 12 to 18 months in passing legislation in the counter-kleptocracy space, we have really seen unprecedented momentum. These loopholes, ending these policies. I'm not going to say one way or the other whether or not it passes, but there is an unprecedented momentum that it is being introduced into that I certainly think it's far likelier it'll pass in the 2020s than it was in the 2010s or in the 2000s or certainly in the 1990s.
Yeah, I'll just say I worked for Congress for nearly a decade, and what I've learned is you can never, ever, ever really estimate these things or say anything about them. I imagine as it's just been introduced, it'll take a few years. I mean, usually a bill doesn't pass right away unless it's like a leadership prerogative. But I mean, you just never know about these things. I mean, if a play is made for the national defense bill, if it's accepted, if it's viewed as a priority, if somebody gets their hands on it and says, yeah, let's do this, it could happen tomorrow. I mean, the crazy thing about Congress is it can move very quickly when it wants to. But oftentimes that kind of consensus isn't there.
Absolutely, that makes sense. So talking about this momentum, I also want to talk about the Enablers Act, which was introduced in 2021 after the release of the Pandora Papers, and it was recently included in the National Defense Bill. The goal of this act is to go after those enablers, those middlemen, those gatekeepers that we were talking about earlier. So Paul, can you tell us about this act and how it's going to help close those loopholes?
Sure. So the Enablers Act, believe it or not, Enablers is a backronym. It's establishing new authorities for business, laundering, and enabling risks to the act. So it's very much, yes.
Paul, can you say that 5 times fast?
Right. It almost matches the Patriot Act, which in fact, I don't know if everybody knows, but is a backronym itself. I don't know that one, but you can look it up. Anyway, the Enablers Act is actually quite simple in design. In the United States, the only financial gatekeepers that are required to do any due diligence, that is, know your customer due diligence, which means ask basic questions about the source of your client's funds, are banks. Those are the only ones. If you're a lawyer, if you're an accountant, if you're an investment advisor, if you're a hedge fund manager, if you're a trust and company formation agent, auditor, so on and so forth, you don't need to ask any questions. And I mean, usually when people hear that, it's like, wait, what? Like, you don't have to ask any questions. So if somebody comes to you with a suitcase full of cash, whatever, millions of dollars in cash, you don't need to ask any questions, even if they look really, really suspicious. Nope, you don't need to ask any questions. So that's what this does, is it provides the authorities to create rules that would make these professions ask those basic due diligence questions that we should have long since asked. I'll just add that international standards, promulgated by the Financial Action Task Force, the United States is a part of, it's kind of the international standard setting body, have this as a requirement, have had this as a requirement for decades. And the United States is like, just never complied. European, the European countries, our allies, everybody has these requirements. We don't. And it's really just kind of extraordinary how sort of behind we are on this. There's a very common transparency standard, but it's one of the major key reasons why blood money is finding its way to the United States.
I was going to say, Paul, there's a great irony in this, in what you just outlined, and the fact that you mentioned the Patriot Act just a moment ago. My book certainly goes into far more detail about this. The Patriot Act had all kinds of civil liberties concerns and violations, but one thing I think a lot of folks aren't aware of is that it is, in many ways, the single greatest piece of anti-money laundering and counter-kleptocracy legislation we've ever seen, because of the specific due diligence requirements it placed on, especially the American banking sector. It went a significant way toward cleaning up the American banking sector. I will say, the American banking industry was really the kind of Wild West in the 1990s. If you had any kind of duffel bag of money, you could bring it to any bank you wanted, no matter where it was, how closely you were related to a dictator. They were happy to take your money. The irony, though, being that the Patriot Act place these regulations on the banking sector, but also place these regulations on real estate, on private investments, on a series of industries that right afterward it issued for these same industries, it issued exemptions for. That is to say, these requirements are on the books, but they're not enforced because there was an exemption that was passed 2003. And the argument was that the U.S. government wanted to study the problem, study the issue, make sure we weren't kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that we weren't cutting these industries off at the knees. And they said it was going to be just a temporary study to see what the effects would be. It's been 2 years. It's been a long time for a temporary study. And we know full well what the effect of. We know just how much damage these unchecked financial flows have done to democracy in the United States and elsewhere, in the source countries and in the destination countries. And it's long past time. It's decades past time that something like the Enablers Act should be passed. So certainly as an American and as someone who works in this space, I am hoping against hope that this legislation is finally passed and signed into law.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. I know we're just about out of time. It really does seem like there's this momentum, Casey, as you mentioned, and this interest. So I do hope that these pieces of legislation can move forward and start addressing kleptocrats and authoritarian regimes putting their money in. Before we end, any kind of last thoughts, any words for our listeners, because there will always be more work to do. I think should we pass this legislation, it will really position the U.S. as a leader on anti-corruption efforts. But what can our listeners, activists, journalists, policymakers, NGOs, what can we do to help push this agenda?
I'll just hop in with one kind of a final thought there, Chris. And well, maybe two final thoughts. One, despite how I suppose depressing some of these topics can be, because certainly the outcomes that we've outlined today, and for as depressing as it can be to cover these topics for a living, I do want to highlight the fact that we have seen it, again, thanks to Paul's work as well as plenty of others, unprecedented momentum in the United States of America to finally cleaning up the American side of this, and in so doing, hopefully, set an example for other peer democracies and other governments, other countries, other nations elsewhere, that the U.S. can actually clean up this own mess of its own making, at least in the American context itself. Again, that's a conversation for another time, but both on the legislative as well as the executive side, we have seen remarkable progress just in the last year alone. So it's not all depressing topics all the time. And I will say, and this is actually something that I mentioned at the Oslo Freedom Forum last month or 2 months ago. Not entirely sure, Kristen, how long ago that was. Time is very malleable these days. But if you are in any communications with any American partners, any American officials, frankly, any Western partners, Western officials, I would highly recommend bringing up the fact that so many of these financial secrecy networks and tools and loopholes exist in Western jurisdictions, and that it behooves these Western officials, these American officials, to clean up these own sectors in the West. Because unless that actually happens, unless that finally happens, there's no reason to think anything will change. We have all the systems, we have all the networks, we have all the loopholes in play and have been in play for decades. And again, we have seen the effect, we have seen the threats, we have seen the fallout that comes from that. So on behalf of Americans, I suppose, please, in conversation with other Americans that are still, many of whom have no idea that the U.S. is the world's greatest financial secrecy haven, please bring it up.
Yeah, I mean, I actually wanted to say practically the same thing as Casey. I mean, the problem with this whole thing is it's made to be opaque. The whole idea is to build a perpetual system of opacity and anonymity, something we can't see, and then we all get worked up at one another because everybody's got this kind of intuition that something is wrong, that something has gone wrong with the global economy. It has. This is it. So talk about it with everybody, not just officials, but with your friends, with your parents, with your cousins, whatever. I mean, it's just, we need to start getting this on the agenda. And I mean, this problem, the great thing about this problem, if there is one great thing, I mean, after all that, it's like, the great thing about this problem is that it's eminently fixable. That if we actually like pass the legislation, we start enforcing this legislation, you fix it. You know, I mean, I sometimes look at the past problems, wars and all that kind of stuff. You can't like outlaw the Soviet Union. There was no winning against Hitler without, invading Normandy. I mean, here, if we pass the right laws, it's over. So I mean, just start talking about it, get it in the narrative, and let's get the United States. I mean, for me, it's the USA. For anybody else, it's their country and in democracies to kind of stand for the values we claim to stand for.
Thank you both. This has been fantastic. Really appreciate you coming here and talking about this issue and also how we can fix it. Like Casey said, it is an incredibly depressing topic, but it is good to have that shred of hope knowing that things are being done and maybe things will change. For our listeners, thank you so much for joining. If you'd like to hear more of Paul and Casey, you can check out the Oslo Freedom Forum on YouTube and see their talk from 2022 Oslo Freedom Forum on corruption and loot acquisition with authoritarian regimes. Have a great day, and thank you again, Casey and Paul. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.